The scrap metal dealer shook his head as he walked around the twisted wreckage. What had once been a proud military helicopter now looked like a giant's discarded toy, broken and forgotten in a remote corner of the salvage yard. The rotors were bent beyond recognition, the cockpit windows were shattered, and rust had claimed most of the fuselage. 3 different aviation experts had already declared it hopeless. The insurance company had written it off completely. Even the military had abandoned all hope of bringing this machine back to life. But sometimes, the most impossible stories begin exactly where everyone else gives up. What nobody knew was that somewhere across the country, an 82-year-old man was reading a newspaper article about this very helicopter. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he recognized something in the grainy photograph that others had missed. Behind his thick glasses, his eyes held secrets that stretched back decades to a time when he had worked on machines just like this one, when every bolt and wire meant the difference between life and death for the crews who flew them. The old man folded the newspaper carefully and reached for his phone. He was about to make a call that would turn an impossible situation into the most remarkable comeback story anyone had ever witnessed. Because some things that appear completely broken aren't broken at all. They're just waiting for the right person to remember how they were meant to work. This is the true story of how one forgotten veteran proved that giving up is sometimes just another word for not looking hard enough. The morning sun cast long shadows across McKinnon Air Base as Captain Sarah Martinez performed her final pre-flight check on Whiskey 74. The UH-60 Black Hawk had served the base faithfully for 8 years, logging over 2,000 flight hours in training exercises and emergency missions. Today was supposed to be routine. A navigation training flight with 3 junior pilots who needed to log hours before their next evaluation. Sarah ran her hand along the helicopter's sleek black fuselage, checking for any signs of wear or damage. Everything looked perfect. The maintenance crew had given Whiskey 74 a clean bill of health just 2 days earlier. Chief Warrant Officer Mike Thompson, the lead mechanic, had personally signed off on every system. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, and the forecast called for calm winds all afternoon. At precisely 10:30, Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat while her co-pilot, Lieutenant James Crawford, settled in beside her. In the passenger compartment, 3 eager young pilots strapped themselves in for what they expected to be an educational but uneventful flight. The plan was simple: fly a predetermined route over the nearby mountains, practice various navigation techniques, and return to base by 1500 hours. The startup sequence went smoothly. Both engines spooled up to normal operating parameters. All instruments showed green, and radio checks came back crystal clear. Sarah lifted Whiskey 74 into a gentle hover, performed the required control checks, and then eased the helicopter forward into climbing flight. Everything felt normal as they climbed to their cruising altitude of 3,000 feet and turned toward the first waypoint. For the first hour, the flight proceeded exactly as planned. The student pilots took turns in the left seat, practicing their navigation skills, while Sarah provided guidance and encouragement. They flew over familiar landmarks, the winding Silver Creek, the abandoned mining town of Copper Falls, and the distinctive peak known locally as Eagle's Nest. Each pilot demonstrated their ability to maintain course and altitude while cross-referencing multiple navigation aids. It was Lieutenant Crawford who first noticed something unusual. About 90 minutes into the flight, as they approached the halfway point of their route, he observed a slight fluctuation in the number 2 engine's operating parameters. The temperature gauge showed a brief spike, then returned to normal. The oil pressure seemed steady, but there was something about the engine's sound that didn't seem quite right. Sarah immediately took control and began running through the appropriate checklist. Both pilots were experienced enough to know that early detection of mechanical problems was crucial when flying over mountainous terrain. They reduced power slightly and began monitoring all engine parameters more closely. For several minutes, everything appeared to stabilize. Then, the real problems began. Without warning, the number 2 engine's temperature gauge jumped into the red zone and stayed there. Simultaneously, they heard a grinding noise that seemed to come from deep within the turbine. Sarah immediately initiated emergency procedures, reducing power on the affected engine while increasing power on the number 1 engine to maintain level flight. She turned the helicopter toward the nearest suitable landing area, a small clearing they had passed about 10 minutes earlier. But the situation deteriorated faster than anyone could have anticipated. The grinding noise grew louder, and suddenly there was a tremendous bang from the rear of the helicopter. The entire aircraft shuddered violently, and Sarah felt the flight controls become sluggish and unresponsive. The number 2 engine had suffered what pilots call an uncontained failure. Mechanical parts had broken loose and damaged other critical systems. Within seconds, Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel like a deadly Christmas tree. Hydraulic pressure was dropping rapidly, which meant that controlling the helicopter would soon require enormous physical strength. The tail rotor authority was diminishing, causing the aircraft to yaw unpredictably. Most critically, the remaining engine was now showing signs of distress as well, probably damaged by debris from its failed companion. Sarah keyed the radio with steady professionalism that belied the desperate nature of their situation. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. McKinnon Base, this is Army 7-4. We have dual engine failure and are going down approximately 15 miles northwest of the base near Eagle's Nest. We have 5 souls on board and are attempting emergency landing." The response came immediately from the control tower. "Army 7-4, McKinnon Tower copies your mayday. Emergency crews are being dispatched. Can you maintain flight?" Sarah was already fighting the controls with both hands, her arms straining against the unresponsive helicopter. The altimeter was unwinding steadily as they descended through 2,500 feet. The mountainous terrain below offered few options for a survivable landing. Most of the area was covered with dense forest, broken only by rocky outcroppings and steep ravines. Lieutenant Crawford was busy with his own checklist, shutting down non-essential systems and preparing the cabin for impact. In the passenger compartment, the 3 student pilots sat in stunned silence, their training exercise having suddenly become a life-or-death emergency. They had all practiced emergency procedures countless times in simulators, but nothing could have prepared them for the violent shaking and grinding noise of an actual in-flight emergency. With less than 2,000 feet of altitude remaining, Sarah spotted what might be their only chance. A narrow meadow squeezed between 2 ridgelines about 3 miles ahead. It was barely large enough for a helicopter, surrounded by tall pine trees, but it was their best option. She turned toward it while continuing to fight the increasingly unresponsive controls. The helicopter was descending much faster than Sarah would have preferred, but she had no choice. The remaining engine was now running extremely rough, threatening to quit entirely at any moment. She had to reach that meadow while they still had some power, because auto-rotation in mountainous terrain with a damaged aircraft would almost certainly be fatal. At 500 feet above the ground, Sarah began her approach to the meadow. The trees seemed to rush up at them with terrifying speed. She was flying the helicopter purely on instinct now, making constant adjustments to compensate for the unpredictable flight characteristics. The tail rotor was barely providing enough authority to keep them pointed in the right direction. Then, just as they cleared the tree line, the remaining engine finally gave up completely. The familiar whine of the turbine wound down to silence, replaced only by the whistle of wind through the damaged rotor system. Sarah immediately lowered the collective to enter auto-rotation, but the damaged rotor blades weren't providing the lift they needed for a controlled descent. The helicopter hit the meadow with tremendous force. The landing gear collapsed immediately, and the aircraft skidded across the uneven ground before tilting sharply to one side. The main rotor blade struck the earth, sending fragments flying in all directions. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the world was filled with the sounds of tearing metal and breaking glass. Then, suddenly, everything was quiet. Sarah was the first to regain consciousness. Her head was pounding, and she could taste blood in her mouth. But she was alive. More importantly, she could hear voices from the passenger compartment. The others were alive too. She quickly shut down all remaining electrical systems and activated the emergency locator beacon before helping to evacuate everyone from the wreckage. All 5 crew members had survived the crash with only minor injuries, a miracle considering the violence of the impact. But as they stood in the meadow, looking at the twisted wreckage of Whiskey 7-4, it was clear that the helicopter was a total loss. The fuselage was cracked, both engines were destroyed, the rotor system was completely demolished, and the landing gear had been torn away. Emergency crews arrived within an hour to evacuate the survivors, but they could only shake their heads at the extent of the damage. Later investigation would reveal that a manufacturing defect in the No. 2 engine had caused the catastrophic failure. A microscopic flaw in one of the turbine blades had finally reached its breaking point after thousands of hours of operation. When the blade failed, it had caused a cascade of secondary damage that ultimately brought down the entire aircraft. The insurance adjusters who examined the wreckage 3 weeks later were unanimous in their assessment. Whiskey 7-4 was beyond repair. The cost of rebuilding would exceed the value of a new helicopter. The military agreed with this assessment and officially wrote off the aircraft as a total loss. Within a month, the wreckage was sold to Alpine Salvage Company for scrap metal value. That was where the story of Whiskey 7-4 should have ended, but sometimes, the end of one story is just the beginning of another. And sometimes, what looks like hopeless destruction to some people looks like possibility to others. 3 months after the crash, A newspaper reporter writing a feature story about military aviation safety visited Alpine Salvage to photograph the wreckage. The photos that accompanied his article showed a machine that bore little resemblance to the proud helicopter that had once served McKinnon Air Base. Weather and time had not been kind to the remains. What the insurance adjusters had declared unrepairable now looked truly hopeless. The newspaper article was picked up by several other publications and eventually made its way to a small town in Montana, where an elderly man named Frank Morrison read it with more interest than most people would have shown. Frank had spent 43 years working on helicopters, first in Vietnam and later at various civilian and military facilities around the country. He had retired 12 years earlier, but old habits die hard. When he saw something that others said was impossible, his first instinct was always to look a little closer. Frank studied the newspaper photograph with a magnifying glass, paying attention to details that the reporter had probably never noticed. After several minutes, he reached for his phone and began making the first of many calls that would eventually change everything. Frank Morrison's workshop in Billings, Montana, looked like a museum of aviation history. The walls were covered with photographs of helicopters from every era, technical manuals stacked floor to ceiling, and boxes of spare parts that most people would have thrown away decades ago. At 82, Frank still spent most of his days in this workshop, tinkering with small projects and maintaining a collection of vintage aviation equipment that aerospace museums would have envied. When Frank called Alpine Salvage Company the owner, Pete Rodriguez, initially thought he was dealing with either a crank caller or someone who didn't understand the extent of the damage to Whiskey 7-4. Pete had been in the salvage business for 25 years and had seen plenty of optimistic people who thought they could restore machines that were clearly beyond hope. "Listen, Mr. Repicard," Morrison, Pete said patiently. "I appreciate your interest, but this helicopter isn't just damaged. It's completely destroyed." 3 different aviation experts have looked at it, and they all said the same thing. The airframe is cracked, both engines are scrap metal, and the transmission case is split wide open. You'd have to rebuild everything from scratch, and even then, you'd never get it certified to fly again. Frank listened politely to Pete's explanation, but he wasn't discouraged. During his 4 decades in aviation maintenance, he had learned to see possibilities where others saw only problems. More importantly, he had recognized something in that newspaper photograph that the experts had apparently missed. The helicopter's tail number, N1748H, meant something to him. "Mr. Rodriguez," Frank said calmly, "I understand your concerns, but I'd like to come take a look at the aircraft myself. I'm willing to pay your asking price sight unseen, but I'd appreciate the chance to examine it before I arrange for transport." Pete was surprised by the old man's confidence, but he agreed to let Frank visit the salvage yard. He warned him again about the condition of the helicopter, but Frank seemed determined to see it for himself. They arranged to meet the following Tuesday. The drive from Billings to the Alpine Salvage Yard near Denver normally took about 8 hours, but Frank made it in 7. He had always been eager when it came to helicopters, and this particular machine had captured his imagination in a way that surprised him. He hadn't felt this excited about a project since his retirement. When Frank first laid eyes on Whiskey 7-4, even he had to admit that it looked hopeless. The helicopter sat in a corner of the salvage yard like a giant broken toy, its once proud lines obscured by damage and neglect. The cockpit windows were gone, the rotor blades had been removed and stacked separately, and weather had begun its inevitable work of corrosion. Most people would have turned around and walked away. But Frank wasn't most people. He spent 3 hours crawling over every inch of the wreckage, taking measurements, making notes, and photographing details that would have been meaningless to anyone else. He examined the cracks in the airframe with a practiced eye, traced wiring harnesses that had been severed in the crash, and inspected components that the insurance adjusters had dismissed as worthless. Pete Rodriguez watched this examination with growing confusion. The old man seemed to know exactly what he was looking at, asking technical questions about the aircraft's history and maintenance records that suggested deep expertise. But Pete couldn't understand why anyone with that level of knowledge would be interested in such obviously destroyed equipment. After his inspection, Frank sat quietly on an overturned crate for several minutes, apparently lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his words surprised Pete even more than his interest in the helicopter had. "I'll take it," Frank said simply. "Can you arrange transport to Montana?" Pete tried one more time to talk Frank out of what seemed like an expensive mistake. "Mr. Morrison, I have to ask, what exactly are you planning to do with this thing? As parts, it might be worth a few $1,000s, but the cost of shipping it to Montana will eat up most of that value. Frank smiled, and for the first time, Pete saw a hint of the excitement that had been building inside the old man since he first saw that newspaper photograph. "I'm not buying it for parts, Mr. Kama. Rodriguez. I'm going to rebuild it, and when I'm finished, it's going to fly better than it ever did before." The transport to Montana took 2 weeks to arrange. Frank had to hire a specialized heavy-haul trucking company that could handle the weight and awkward dimensions of the disassembled helicopter. While he waited for delivery, he began preparing his workshop for the biggest project of his retirement. Frank's workshop was already well equipped, but rebuilding a helicopter would require tools and equipment that even he didn't normally keep on hand. He contacted old friends throughout the aviation industry, arranging to borrow or purchase specialized hydraulic presses, precision measuring instruments, and machining equipment. His small workshop began to resemble a professional aircraft maintenance facility. When the helicopter finally arrived, Frank had converted his entire property into a restoration facility. His workshop would house the major components, while a temporary hangar constructed in his backyard would provide space for final assembly. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to Frank's quiet retirement were amazed by the sudden transformation of his property into what looked like an aircraft factory. The first challenge was simply understanding the full extent of the damage. While Frank had done a preliminary assessment at the salvage yard, a detailed examination revealed problems that hadn't been immediately obvious. The main transmission case, which forms the structural heart of any helicopter, had indeed cracked during the crash. But Frank's experienced eye could see that the crack followed the line of an old repair, suggesting that the transmission had been damaged and fixed before. This discovery led Frank to request the helicopter's complete maintenance records from the military. What he found in those files confirmed his suspicions and explained why he had been drawn to this particular aircraft, Whiskey 74 had originally been built in 1983, but it had undergone a complete rebuild in 1998 at a facility where Frank had worked as lead technician. He remembered the aircraft now. It had been damaged in a hard landing during a training exercise, and the military had initially considered scrapping it. But Frank had convinced his supervisors that the helicopter could be rebuilt to like-new condition. He had personally overseen every aspect of that reconstruction, replacing damaged components with improved parts and upgrading systems wherever possible. Looking at the maintenance records, Frank could see his own signature on dozens of inspection reports and work orders. This helicopter wasn't just any crashed aircraft. It was one that he had brought back from the dead once before. And now, 14 years later, fate had brought it to his attention again. The revelation that he had previously worked on this same helicopter transformed Frank's approach to the project. He wasn't just rebuilding a crashed aircraft anymore. He was restoring something that he had helped create. Every component had a history that he understood. Every system had been installed according to specifications that he had helped develop. Frank began the restoration by completely disassembling what remained of the helicopter. Each part was catalogued, photographed, and evaluated for possible reuse. Components that could be repaired were set aside for rebuilding, while parts that were beyond salvage were replaced with items from Frank's extensive collection of spare parts. The work was painstaking and methodical. Frank had learned decades ago that successful aircraft maintenance required absolute attention to detail. A single overlooked flaw could result in catastrophic failure, so every component had to be perfect. He began each day at sunrise and worked until darkness, driven by an enthusiasm that surprised even him. Word of Frank's project began to spread through the small aviation community around Billings. Other retired mechanics and pilots started stopping by to observe the restoration and offer advice. Most of them were skeptical about the possibility of returning such a severely damaged helicopter to airworthy condition, but they were impressed by Frank's methodical approach and obvious expertise. As winter approached, Frank's workshop became an informal gathering place for local aviation enthusiasts. The restoration of Whiskey 74 provided a fascinating glimpse into the complex engineering that makes helicopter flight possible. Frank was always happy to explain what he was doing and why, turning the project into an educational experience for anyone interested in learning. But despite the encouragement of his visitors, Frank sometimes wondered if he was attempting the impossible. The helicopter had suffered damage that went far beyond what most people would consider repairable. Insurance companies and military experts had written it off for good reasons. The cost of new parts alone would exceed the value of a comparable used helicopter. During these moments of doubt, Frank would return to the maintenance records and remember the aircraft as it had been during its 1998 rebuild. He could see in his mind how each system was supposed to work, how every component fit together to create a machine capable of defying gravity. That vision sustained him through the long hours of detailed work required to make it reality once again. As the first winter of the restoration project settled over Montana, Frank Morrison continued working in his heated workshop, methodically rebuilding one of the most complex machines ever created. Outside, snow covered the temporary hangar where the restored helicopter would eventually take shape. But inside the workshop, surrounded by carefully organized piles of parts and components, an old man with steady hands and unlimited patience was proving that some things that appear completely broken aren't broken at all. 6 months into the restoration, Frank Morrison faced his first major crisis. The main transmission, which he had hoped to rebuild using existing components, turned out to be more severely damaged than his initial assessment had indicated. The crack in the housing was just the beginning. Internal gears showed signs of stress fractures, and several bearings had been damaged beyond repair when debris from the failed engines had contaminated the transmission oil. Frank sat in his workshop on a cold February morning, staring at the disassembled transmission components spread across his workbench. Each piece represented hundreds of hours of precision manufacturing, and several of them were no longer available from any supplier. The helicopter had been out of production for years, and spare parts for this particular transmission variant were extremely rare. For the first time since beginning the project, Frank seriously considered the possibility that he might have to admit defeat. The cost of having new transmission components manufactured would be astronomical, assuming it was even possible to find a company willing to take on such a specialized job. Most machine shops weren't equipped to work to the exacting tolerances required for aircraft components. But Frank had spent too many years solving impossible problems to give up easily. He began reaching out to contacts throughout the aviation industry, searching for someone who might have the parts he needed or the capability to manufacture new ones. His first dozen phone calls were discouraging. Either people didn't have what he needed, or they quoted prices that were completely unrealistic for a private restoration project. Then Frank remembered Tommy Chen, a machinist he had worked with during his years at the military overhaul facility. Tommy had left government service around the same time Frank retired, but last Frank had heard, he was running his own precision manufacturing business somewhere in California. It took several calls to track down Tommy's current contact information, but Frank eventually reached him at Pacific Precision Manufacturing in San Diego. Tommy was delighted to hear from his old colleague and fascinated by the description of Frank's restoration project. More importantly, he still had access to the original engineering drawings for the transmission components that Frank needed. Tommy's company specialized in manufacturing replacement parts for vintage aircraft, and he was confident that he could produce the required components to original specifications. The only catch was timing. Tommy's shop was backed up with orders for several months, and the transmission parts would be complex enough to require significant setup time on his CNC machines. He estimated that it would take at least 4 months to complete Frank's order, and that was assuming no unexpected complications arose during manufacturing. Frank accepted Tommy's timeline without complaint. He had learned long ago that good work couldn't be rushed, especially when it involved safety-critical aircraft components. The delay would actually give him time to continue working on other aspects of the restoration while waiting for the transmission parts to be completed. While Tommy worked on the transmission components in California, Frank turned his attention to the helicopter's engines. Both Pratt and Whitney turbines had been completely destroyed in the crash, but Frank had managed to locate 2 low-time replacement engines through his network of industry contacts. The engines had come from helicopters that had been retired for reasons unrelated to power plant problems, and both had been properly preserved for long-term storage. Rebuilding turbine engines was work that Frank preferred to leave to specialists, but he wanted to personally supervise the process to ensure that everything was done to the highest possible standards. He arranged to have both engines shipped to Turbine Technologies International in Arizona, a company that specialized in rebuilding helicopter power plants for both military and civilian customers. The chief engineer at Turbine Technologies, Maria Santos, had worked with Frank on several projects during their respective government careers. She was impressed by his detailed documentation of the helicopter's service history and agreed to perform the engine rebuilds according to specifications that would actually exceed the original manufacturer's standards.
"We'll essentially be giving you brand new engines," Maria explained during a phone conversation.
Everything will be rebuilt to zero-time condition, and will incorporate all the latest service bulletins and improvements. When we're finished, these engines will be more reliable than what originally came with the aircraft. While waiting for the engines and transmission components, Frank continued working on the hundreds of smaller parts and systems that make up a helicopter. The electrical system required almost complete replacement, since many of the wire harnesses had been damaged in the crash. The hydraulic system needed new pumps, filters, and actuators. The flight control system required replacement of several critical components that had been bent or cracked during the impact. Each system presented its own challenges, but Frank approached them all with the same methodical patience that had served him throughout his career. He created detailed work plans for each major assembly, breaking complex jobs into manageable steps that could be completed and inspected before moving on to the next phase. The restoration was also attracting attention from unexpected quarters. A reporter from Aviation Week magazine heard about Frank's project through industry contacts and drove up from Denver to write a feature story about the restoration. The resulting article, titled "One Man's Mission to Resurrect the Impossible," generated responses from aviation enthusiasts around the world. Frank began receiving calls and emails from people offering advice, spare parts, and encouragement. Several retired military mechanics volunteered to help with specific aspects of the work, and Frank gratefully accepted assistance from those whose expertise complemented his own. What had started as a solitary project was gradually becoming a collaborative effort involving dozens of people who shared Frank's belief that the helicopter could be restored. One of the most valuable contributors was Sandra Williams, a former flight test engineer who had worked on helicopter certification programs for the Federal Aviation Administration. Sandra had read the Aviation Week article and was intrigued by the technical challenges involved in returning a crashed aircraft to airworthy condition. She contacted Frank and offered to help navigate the complex regulatory requirements for getting the restored helicopter approved to fly again. The certification process would be one of the most difficult aspects of the entire project. The Federal Aviation Administration doesn't routinely approve aircraft that have suffered major structural damage for return to service. Frank would need to demonstrate that every aspect of the restoration met or exceeded original manufacturing standards, and that the repaired aircraft was actually safer than it had been when new. Sandra's expertise proved invaluable in developing the documentation that would be required for FAA approval. She helped Frank create a comprehensive restoration plan that detailed every component replacement, every repair procedure, and every test that would be performed to verify the aircraft's airworthiness. The resulting document was over 300 pages long and included detailed photographs of every major assembly. By the end of the first year, Frank's workshop had been transformed into something resembling a small aircraft factory. The main workbench was covered with precisely organized tools and partially assembled components. Storage racks held hundreds of parts in various stages of restoration. Charts on the walls tracked the progress of each major system, with green checkmarks indicating completed work and red marks showing areas that still needed attention. The helicopter's airframe, which had looked hopeless when it first arrived in Montana, was beginning to resemble an aircraft again. Frank had painstakingly repaired the cracks using techniques that were actually stronger than the original construction methods. New wiring harnesses snaked through the fuselage, connecting systems that had been completely rebuilt to modern standards. The cockpit was taking shape with new instruments, updated avionics, and flight controls that had been precision rebuilt to original specifications. Frank had decided to upgrade several systems to take advantage of modern technology while maintaining the aircraft's original design characteristics. The result would be a helicopter that looked exactly like it had when new but incorporated reliability improvements that hadn't existed in 1983. As winter gave way to spring, Frank received word that the transmission components were ready for shipment from California. Tommy Chen had actually completed the work ahead of schedule, and preliminary testing showed that all parts met or exceeded the original design specifications. The engines from Turbine Technologies were also nearing completion, with final testing scheduled for the following month. Frank realized that he was approaching a critical milestone in the restoration. Within a few months, he would have all the major components ready for final assembly. The helicopter that had been written off as hopeless scrap metal was about to become a complete aircraft again. But the real test would come when it was time to prove that all of Frank's careful work had actually resulted in a machine capable of safe flight. As spring turned to summer in Montana, Frank Morrison continued his methodical work in the shop that had become the center of an aviation restoration miracle. Outside, the temporary hangar waited patiently for the day when the rebuilt helicopter would finally be wheeled inside for final assembly. That day was still months away, but for the first time since beginning the project, Frank was confident that it would actually happen. The helicopter that insurance companies had declared beyond repair was slowly but surely proving them wrong. In the skilled hands of a man who refused to accept the impossible, Whiskey 74 was being reborn. 18 months after Frank Morrison first saw the newspaper photograph of the crashed helicopter, he stood in his workshop, surrounded by the components of what would soon become a complete aircraft. The rebuilt transmission had arrived from California and had passed all preliminary tests. Both engines had been returned from Arizona with zero-time certifications that guaranteed their reliability. The airframe repairs were complete, and every system had been painstakingly restored to like-new condition. But Frank knew that the most challenging part of the project still lay ahead.
All of his careful work had to be assembled into a functioning helicopter, and then that helicopter had to prove that it could actually fly safely. The Federal Aviation Administration had been following the restoration progress through Sandra Williams, and they had made it clear that their standards for approving the aircraft would be extremely rigorous.
The final assembly process began in Frank's temporary hangar, which had been equipped with the overhead cranes and specialized tools necessary to handle major aircraft components. Frank had recruited a team of volunteers to help with the assembly, retired mechanics, local pilots, and aviation enthusiasts who had been following the project since its early days. The first step was installing the rebuilt transmission in the airframe. This massive component, weighing over 400 pounds, had to be positioned with absolute precision to ensure proper alignment with the rotor system and engine mounts. Frank supervised every aspect of the installation, checking and double-checking measurements that had to be accurate within thousandths of an inch. The transmission installation took 3 days, with frequent stops to verify alignment and torque specifications. Frank had learned decades ago that rushing critical assembly work was the surest way to create problems that would be difficult and expensive to fix later. Every bolt was tightened to exact specifications, every connection was inspected multiple times, and every measurement was verified against the original engineering drawings. Next came the engines, which had to be mounted to the airframe and connected to the transmission through a complex arrangement of drive shafts and couplings. Each engine weighed nearly 300 pounds and required careful handling to avoid damage during installation. Frank had designed special lifting fixtures to support the engines during the mounting process, ensuring that no stress would be placed on delicate components. The engine installation revealed the first significant problem of the final assembly phase. The mounting bolts for the number 1 engine didn't align properly with the threaded inserts in the airframe. Careful investigation revealed that the crash damage had been more extensive than initially apparent. The engine mounting structure had been slightly deformed, and the previous repair work hadn't completely restored the original geometry. Frank faced a difficult decision. He could machine new mounting holes in different locations, but this would require extensive modifications to both the airframe and the engine mounts. Alternatively, he could remove the affected section of the airframe and perform a more extensive repair to restore the original mounting geometry. Either approach would add weeks to the assembly schedule and create additional work that would have to be documented for the FAA. After consulting with Sandra Williams and reviewing the regulatory requirements, Frank decided to perform the more extensive repair. The helicopter had to be absolutely perfect before it would be approved to fly, and any compromise in the mounting structure could create safety issues later. Frank carefully cut out the damaged section of the airframe and fabricated a replacement piece that exactly matched the original specifications. The airframe repair took 2 weeks, but the result was a mounting structure that was actually stronger than the original design. Frank had used modern welding techniques and improved materials that provided better fatigue resistance than the 1983 manufacturing methods. When the engines were finally installed, they aligned perfectly with the transmission and showed no signs of stress or misalignment. With the major components in place, Frank began the process of connecting all the helicopter's systems. Miles of wiring had to be routed through the airframe, connecting instruments, controls, and safety systems in precisely the right configuration. Hydraulic lines had to be installed and tested to ensure they could handle the high pressures generated during flight operations. Fuel lines, oil lines, and cooling air ducts all had to be connected according to specifications that left no room for error. The complexity of helicopter systems became apparent during this phase of the assembly. Unlike fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters require constant adjustment and coordination between multiple interconnected systems. The flight controls are linked to the engine controls, which are connected to the transmission controls, which interface with the rotor system. A problem in any one area can affect the entire aircraft. Frank spent long hours checking and rechecking every connection, every adjustment, and every calibration. He had created detailed checklists for each system, and he methodically worked through every item to ensure that nothing was overlooked. Sandra Williams visited regularly to inspect the work and verify that it met FAA standards for certification. As autumn approached, the helicopter was finally beginning to look like a complete aircraft. The rotor blades had been professionally rebuilt and balanced, and they were installed with new hardware that exceeded the original design specifications. The cockpit was complete with modern instruments and updated avionics that would make the helicopter easier and safer to fly than it had ever been. The final major task was the installation and testing of all electrical systems. Modern helicopters depend on electronic systems for everything from engine control to navigation, and every circuit had to function perfectly before the aircraft could be approved for flight. Frank had upgraded many of the electrical systems during the restoration, incorporating modern technology that improved both reliability and capability. Testing the electrical systems required running the engines for the first time since the restoration began. Frank had been looking forward to this moment for months, but he was also nervous about the possibility of discovering problems that would require additional work. The first engine start would be a crucial test of all his careful assembly work. On a crisp October morning, with several witnesses present to document the milestone, Frank initiated the startup sequence for the number 1 engine. The turbine began spinning slowly, then accelerated as fuel flow increased and ignition occurred. The familiar whine of a healthy turbine engine filled the hangar, and Frank watched the instruments carefully as temperatures and pressures stabilized within normal ranges. The engine ran perfectly, showing none of the irregularities that might indicate assembly problems. After a 10-minute run to verify normal operation, Frank shut down the first engine and started the second. It too ran smoothly, with all parameters well within acceptable limits. For the first time since beginning the restoration, Frank allowed himself to believe that the helicopter might actually fly again. But engine runs on the ground were only the beginning of the testing process. The helicopter still had to undergo extensive ground testing to verify that all systems worked correctly together. The flight controls had to be checked for proper response, the rotor system had to be balanced and tested, and hundreds of individual components had to demonstrate that they met certification standards. The ground testing phase revealed several minor problems that required attention. A fuel flow sensor was reading incorrectly and had to be recalibrated. One of the hydraulic pumps was producing pressure slightly outside the acceptable range and needed adjustment. The radio system had an intermittent problem that took several days to track down and repair. Each problem was methodically diagnosed and corrected, with all work documented according to FAA requirements. Frank had learned that aviation authorities were particularly careful about aircraft that had suffered major damage, and they would scrutinize every aspect of the restoration before granting approval to fly. As winter approached again, Frank realized that the helicopter was nearly ready for its ultimate test. All systems were functioning correctly, all documentation had been completed, and the FAA was preparing to conduct their final inspection. If everything went well, the aircraft that had been declared hopeless scrap metal 2 years earlier would soon be ready to return to the sky. The transformation was remarkable. What had arrived in Montana as twisted wreckage now sat in Frank's hangar, looking like a brand new helicopter. Every surface gleamed with fresh paint, every component had been rebuilt to perfect condition, and every system exceeded the original design specifications. It was a testament to the power of determination, skill, and the refusal to accept that some things are impossible. Frank Morrison had spent 2 years proving that experts could be wrong, that insurance companies could be too quick to write off damaged equipment, and that one person with enough knowledge and patience could accomplish what entire organizations had declared impossible. But the final proof would come only when the helicopter lifted off the ground and demonstrated that it was truly ready to fly again. The FAA inspection team arrived in Billings on a cold Monday morning in November, 2 years and 3 months after Frank Morrison had first seen the newspaper photograph that started this remarkable journey. Lead Inspector Janet Rodriguez had 30 years of experience evaluating aircraft for return to service, and she had seen plenty of restoration projects that looked impressive but failed to meet the strict standards required for flight certification. Frank had spent weeks preparing for this inspection, organizing documentation that detailed every aspect of the restoration work. The inspector would need to verify that each repair met original design specifications, that all replacement parts were properly certified for aircraft use, and that the completed helicopter would be as safe as negative or safer than negative it had been when originally manufactured. The inspection process was exhaustive. Inspector Rodriguez examined every major component, checked the calibration of every instrument, and tested the operation of every system. She reviewed Frank's maintenance records, verified the certifications of all replacement parts, and interviewed the volunteers who had assisted with various aspects of the restoration. Sandra Williams had prepared Frank well for this process, and his documentation was more complete than many professional restoration facilities typically provided. Every modification was clearly explained, every repair was photographed and documented, and every test result was recorded in precise detail. The inspector was clearly impressed by the thoroughness of Frank's work, but she maintained the professional skepticism that her position required. The most critical part of the inspection focused on the airframe repairs. The FAA had to be convinced that the structural integrity of the helicopter had been completely restored despite the extensive crash damage. Frank had not only repaired the original damage, but had actually strengthened several areas using improved materials and techniques that exceeded the original design standards. Inspector Rodriguez spent an entire day examining the airframe repairs with specialized equipment that could detect stress concentrations and potential failure points. She performed dye-penetrant inspections on critical welds, checked bolt torques throughout the structure, and verified that all load paths met engineering specifications. The inspection revealed no defects or areas of concern. The engine and transmission inspections were equally thorough. Both power plants had been completely rebuilt by certified facilities, but the inspector had to verify that they were properly installed and integrated with the aircraft systems. She reviewed the engine logbooks, tested all control linkages, and verified that safety systems would function correctly in emergency situations. On Thursday afternoon, after 4 days of intensive inspection, Janet Rodriguez completed her evaluation and sat down with Frank to discuss her findings. Frank had been confident about the quality of his work, but he was still nervous about the possibility that some detail might not meet the inspector's standards. "Mr. Morrison," Inspector Rodriguez began, "I have to tell you that this is one of the most thorough restoration projects I've ever evaluated. Your documentation is exemplary, your workmanship exceeds industry standards, and the completed aircraft is actually safer than it was when it originally left the factory." Frank felt a surge of relief and pride, but the inspector wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "there's still one final hurdle before we can issue the airworthiness certificate. The aircraft has to complete a successful test flight program to demonstrate that it performs correctly in all flight regimes. Are you prepared to begin flight testing?" Frank had been anticipating this requirement. He had already arranged for Captain Sarah Martinez, the pilot who had been flying Whiskey 74 when it crashed, to conduct the test flights. Sarah had volunteered for this duty when she learned about Frank's restoration project, saying that she wanted to be the first person to fly the helicopter that had nearly cost her life. The flight test program would begin with basic ground runs to verify that all systems functioned correctly while the helicopter was secured to the ground. If those tests were successful, the program would progress to hover testing, then pattern flights around the airport, and finally to a complete functional check flight that would exercise every system and capability. Frank had spent months preparing for the flight test phase. He had established a base of operations at Billings Logan International Airport, where the helicopter would have access to professional ground support equipment and emergency services. The airport management had been fascinated by Frank's project and had provided hangar space and technical assistance free of charge. The ground test runs began the following Monday. With the helicopter secured to a concrete pad by chains and ground anchors, Sarah Martinez started both engines and began systematically testing every system. The flight controls responded correctly to her inputs. The engines ran smoothly throughout their operating range, and all instruments provided accurate readings. After 2 days of ground testing, Inspector Rodriguez authorized the first hover flights. These would be conducted with the helicopter tethered to the ground by cables that would prevent it from climbing more than 10 feet or moving more than 50 feet in any direction. If problems developed during these tests, the helicopter could be quickly returned to the ground without risking damage or injury. The first hover flight was scheduled for Wednesday morning, and Frank arrived at the airport before dawn to perform a final inspection of the helicopter. Every system was checked one more time, fluid levels were verified, and control surfaces were tested for proper movement. By 9 o'clock, everything was ready for the moment that Frank had been working toward for over 2 years. Captain Martinez climbed into the left seat of the helicopter that she had crash-landed in a mountain meadow 30 months earlier. The cockpit looked familiar but different. All the instruments were new, the controls had been precision rebuilt, and the overall appearance was that of a brand new aircraft rather than the battle-worn machine she remembered. "How does it feel to be back in 7-4? Frank asked through the intercom system. Sarah smiled as she completed her pre-flight checks. "It feels like coming home to a house that's been completely remodeled. Everything is where it should be, but everything is better than it used to be." With Inspector Rodriguez and Frank watching from the ground, Sarah began the startup sequence. Both engines started normally and ran smoothly through their warm-up cycles. All instruments showed normal readings, and the helicopter responded correctly to control inputs. After a thorough ground check, Sarah was cleared for the first hover attempt. The helicopter lifted smoothly off the ground, rising to a stable hover about 6 feet above the concrete pad. Sarah held the hover for several minutes, testing the response of the flight controls and checking that all systems continued to function normally. The helicopter felt solid and stable, with no vibrations or unusual characteristics that might indicate problems. Over the next week, the hover testing gradually expanded to include movements in all directions, power changes, and emergency procedures. The helicopter performed flawlessly through every test, demonstrating that Frank's careful restoration work had produced an aircraft that was not only airworthy but superior to its original condition. The final phase of flight testing involved unrestricted flights around the local area. These flights would test the helicopter's performance at various speeds and altitudes, verify that all systems functioned correctly during sustained flight operations, and demonstrate that the aircraft met all certification standards for return to service. On a clear morning in December, Captain Martinez lifted Whiskey 74 off the ground for its first free flight since the crash. Frank watched from the ground as the helicopter climbed smoothly away from the airport, its fresh paint gleaming in the winter sunlight. After circling the field several times at different altitudes, Sarah returned for a perfect landing on the designated spot. "It flies better than you," she announced over the radio. "All systems are working perfectly, and the performance has actually improved over the original specifications." Inspector Rodriguez conducted a final examination of the helicopter after the successful test flights and signed the paperwork that officially returned Whiskey 74 to active service. The aircraft that insurance companies had written off as total loss, that military experts had declared beyond repair, and that salvage dealers had sold for scrap metal value, was now certified to fly again. The restoration had taken 2 years and 4 months, cost Frank most of his retirement savings, and required the assistance of dozens of volunteers. But the result was extraordinary. A helicopter that was safer, more reliable, and more capable than it had ever been during its original service life. Word of the successful restoration spread quickly through the aviation community. The helicopter that had been declared hopeless had become a symbol of what could be accomplished through determination, skill, and the refusal to accept that some things are impossible. Frank began receiving inquiries from museums and collectors who wanted to acquire the aircraft, but he had different plans for Whiskey 74. Frank donated the restored helicopter to the local emergency medical service, which had been struggling to afford a modern aircraft for their life flight operations. The helicopter that had once crashed while training military pilots would now save civilian lives, carrying emergency medical teams to accident scenes and transporting critically injured patients to hospitals. On the day that Frank officially turned the helicopter over to the medical service, Captain Martinez flew it one final time, from the airport to its new home at Billings Clinic. Frank rode in the passenger seat during this transfer flight, experiencing for the first time the sensation of flying in the aircraft that had consumed 2 years of his life. As they flew over the Montana countryside, Frank reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. A newspaper photograph had captured his attention, leading him to purchase what others considered worthless wreckage. Months of careful planning had been followed by years of painstaking work. Countless hours had been spent solving problems that others said couldn't be solved. The helicopter settled gently onto the landing pad at Billings Clinic, where it would begin a new phase of its service life. Emergency medical teams were already training to use the aircraft, and within weeks it would be responding to calls throughout southern Montana. The machine that had been abandoned as scrap metal would soon be saving lives. Frank Morrison climbed out of Whiskey 74 for the last time, but he wasn't sad about ending his involvement with the aircraft. He had accomplished something that most people would have considered impossible, proving that expertise, determination, and patience could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The helicopter that everyone had given up on was now ready to serve others for many years to come. As he watched the emergency medical team conduct their first training exercises with the restored helicopter, Frank smiled with the satisfaction that comes from a job well done. Sometimes, the most impossible stories have the most remarkable endings. And sometimes, what looks completely broken just needs someone who remembers how it was supposed to work.